Well, welcome everyone to this third in our series of talks about Chinese philosophy, and so glad to see some of you here. Greetings to all of you weighing in. I want to just shout out to former students, community members, family and friends, long lost friends, new friends, all kinds of people showing up. So anybody who's discovered us along the way, you're also welcome. Today we're going to be wrapping up our series of discussions, and hopefully, and this is my plan, is that it is more or less freestanding, and so that you don't need to have been here for the other two. Of course, I always think that the more you know, I think the more you get out of things, so it will come in handy, but I'm hoping that even people who are showing up for the first time will still be able to get something out of this. I know, so let me be clear that our topic today, as so many of our topics have been, is a little self-indulgent because I just love this so much. I mean, so what I'm planning to do is just to read together some parts of the Dao De Jing and the Zhuangzi, two major Taoist texts, and discuss them together and see what we get out of it. And some of you who have done this kind of thing with me in the past, and it may sound boring, but I think when we actually start doing it and you start seeing where these ideas come from and why this is such amazing literature and the poetry and the insight, hopefully it will seem not quite so completely self-indulgent. So I don't want to exaggerate or over dramatize or anything, but between the two of these texts, I've read them hundreds of times in Chinese, and I still find that I get new stuff out of them every time. That's just endlessly profound. I always get a thrill. Opening up the book, I read a few passages, and it's like hearing the overture to a musical theater production or something. It just kind of goes up and down my spine. So, sorry, but again, this is probably more for me than anyone else. So one issue that we need to raise, and this is especially true as we start talking about some chapters from the Lao Tzu, and we're only going to be reading a few chapters, and I'm picking them because I think they illustrate certain issues, and so, and we're not even going to focus on, in many cases, the entire chapter, just maybe on a few lines, because I think, again, I'm just trying to make certain points along the way. I do think also, if you have other translations of the Dao De Jing or the Zhuangzi handy, it might be helpful to have them on hand, because, again, and so if you are reading along, following the bouncing ball, and your translation sounds completely different than what I'm discussing here, then absolutely feel free to raise that point in the questions, and I can address why I think perhaps one translation is better than the other. When we're talking about the Dao De Jing, we're going to be using my translation. When we're talking about the Zhuangzi, we're going to be using the translation of the absolute master of the field, Burton Watson. There's absolutely no way that anybody, I think, can produce a more profound or insightful, just great translation. It's just state of the art. Anyway, now I'm fangirling. But anyway, so, but as far as the Dao De Jing is concerned, there are dozens of good translations. Any of them would be helpful. Not Stephen Mitchell, okay? Those of you who have worked on this text with me in the past, this should not be news to you, but, and I'm not going to go into elaborate detail, but Stephen Mitchell to me is the worst. Stephen Mitchell's translation to me is the worst example of the kind of stuff that passes for translations, especially with regard to the Dao De Jing. It's been translated into English literally hundreds of times, and Mitchell's translation in particular, not to dwell on it, is basically all made up. Half of the text actually isn't in his translation, and half of what he calls his translation isn't actually in the original text. He can't read Chinese. He thinks he met Lao Tzu in a dream. That gives him carte blanche to interpret the text broadly. So anyway, that's the kind of thing that I find extremely unreliable. And on the other hand, there are some very reliable translations, and I've listed a few between the last couple of handouts. But for today, I think we're going to focus on just my translation, and I'm not going to necessarily argue for it as opposed to other translations. Those of you who were here last time know that my reading is what we're calling a process reading, a dynamic reading, which differs from any of the standard translations. So if it does seem different, it should. So let's take it as we go along. Now, when we talk about the Dao De Jing, which ostensibly is written by this guy named Lao Tzu. Now, the legendary account is that Lao Tzu was the librarian at the imperial palace, had a reputation for being the wisest man in all of China. He was the master of all the Confucian texts and rituals and songs and everything. And basically, at one point or another, consistent with what we described as this Taoist migration out of the urban centers during the Warring States period, the story indicates that Lao Tzu got fed up with urban life and decided to head for the hills, got up on his ox, left everything behind, and left. On the way, if you know anything about the topography of the Forbidden City, it's basically a bowl surrounded by mountains where there are only a few passes into the bowl. And so basically those passes were, of course, guarded. And so when Lao Tzu approached what I believe was the Western Pass, the gatekeeper there said, "Wait a minute, I recognize you. You're Lao Tzu. You can't leave. You're the smartest man in all of China. You're like a national treasure. So if you want to go, you need to first write down everything you know." Now, for most of us, writing down everything we know would take about 5 minutes. For Lao Tzu, it actually seems to take about 5 minutes. That is to say, he gets down off the ox and he scribbles out the Daodejing, which even by today's, the version we have today is about 5,000 characters. Even that is a short text by Chinese standards. So the idea is he just kind of scribbled this thing out. My argument, as we will proceed, and I'll make this argument using one of the chapters, is that the text was originally much, much shorter than that. So the idea is it was originally probably extremely brief and terse. And so the idea is he got down off the ox, he scribbled out this text, got back on the ox and headed for the hills, from which point there are a variety of versions of what happens after that. But as far as that story is concerned, it's, again, I don't want to offend anybody who actually believes in that story. It's a little bit to me like believing in Santa Claus, because it's almost certainly not the case. The details seem to come into the history books, Sima Qian's history anyway, hundreds of years after the purported events, without absolutely no trail or chain of records or anything that seems to lead up to that. So it does seem as though Sima Qian may have kind of, or somebody else, and he might have got it from that person, invented this tale out of whole cloth to explain certain features of the Dao De Jing. One of which is, as we said, its brevity, its terseness. In other words, I'm saying this story, this legendary origin account, like many origin accounts, seems to be kind of retrofitted, written after the fact to explain certain features of the tradition. And one of them is this brevity, this terseness, and that enables something that we're going to deal with in many of the chapters that we talk about, which is what's called polysemy, or variety of meanings. The fact is, this text can be read, the Dao De Jing in particular, can be read in so many different ways. And if you go to a website, or, again, a moment for borders, but if you go to a good bookstore with a lot of books about this subject, there'll be all kinds of books about the psychologists' Dao De Jing, the Buddhist Dao De Jing, this Dao De Jing, the mechanics Dao De Jing. And again, these principles seem to be it's just so universally applicable. So the book can be actually read as though it were a meditation manual, as a book on how to manage businesses or organizations, how to rule a government. So many times the text will say, and therefore the sage rules by, and then give some prescription. How to stay out of the way of the big powers that are fighting all over each other. Remember, this is the Warring States period. Or how just to best enjoy life and be fulfilled. So, I mean, the text can be read in so many different ways, and arguably that polysemy is the result of this brevity, this terseness, and the fact that so much is left kind of to the imagination, and it becomes a little bit of a Rorschach blot that we find ourselves in the text, in how we read the text. I think there's a lot of projection going on. And as we'll see, a lot of translator imposition, superimposition going on if you compare translations especially, that'll become obvious. So anyway, with that in mind then, I did want to emphasize as far as my history with the text too. I first read a translation of the Dao De Jing when I was in college. It was the big coffee table version of Jiafu Feng's translation, if anybody has that, with a lot of nice photographs and things like that. And it is a perfect example of the ontological reading that we discussed last time. But I was entranced by it. I was completely enchanted by it. It seemed so mysterious and poetic and beautiful. And it is a beautiful translation, even though at this point I think I've outgrown that ontological reading. But as far as that ontological reading is concerned, it's a beautiful translation. And I think the same would be true of John Wu's translation, just if anybody's keeping track of these things. Beautiful, but very ontological, with this eternal Tao that can't be spoken of. So I read it and first read it in translation. When I got to grad school, I had an immensely influential classmate. Shout out to Dan Lusthouse. I don't know if he's in the audience at all. I doubt it. But anyway, he set up a reading group among the grad students where we took a chapter of the Daodejing once a week and went through it, the Chinese characters, line by line, character by character, and basically hashed it out. And those of my former students who for 25 years sat through those reading sessions with me, those reading groups, that's where that came from. It should sound very familiar to you. But so basically I learned to read Chinese by reading the Dao De Jing, by looking up every character, comparing it to translations, going back and looking at it again. And of course I've had more substantial training since then, but it completely changed the course of my studies. I was originally interested in religion and psychology, as some of you know, and then my interest shifted to Chinese philosophy. And then one last point about the Dao De Jing that I think is really significant. Again, I had pretty much bought into the ontological reading, the idea that the Tao that can be spoken of is not the eternal Tao. And when I was going up for my PhD, you had to do oral exams, and then you had to defend your oral exams before you could move on to the dissertation phase. And one of my dissertation members at that point was a man named Richard DiMartino. He eventually had to drop out because his mom got sick. But he was a very famous scholar of Zen Buddhism. And at my oral defense, I mentioned something about the first line of the Dao De Jing, that the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. And that, I got to tell you, I had a Zen moment there when he said, "So you mean there is an eternal Tao?" And I had to say, and I was completely flabbergasted, and that blew my mind. And so since then, I think I've been struggling to overcome what I think are those initial kind of misguided and maybe premature perceptions of the text. So with that in mind, yes?
Do you have a question about a particular translation?
So the translation by James Legge, that is a particularly interesting translation. It's one of the very earliest ones. And what's fascinating about that translation is that he makes it into poetry and into mostly rhyme, which again, it probably did. It was probably originally poetry, but at least the core of it, I think, was originally poetry, as I'll demonstrate later. But Legge to me is just the founder of the whole field, and I really love reading Legge's translations, even though they're, I think, a little bit dated. The other advantage of reading Legge's translations is that they come in Dover book editions, which are generally very inexpensive and high quality editions, but they also have the Chinese text with the characters and all the glossaries and stuff like that. So if you wanted to do any more substantial work on the actual original text, then that would be a good way to do it. And again, there are some horrible translations. And I'm not talking about John Wu's Tao of Hong Kong gunfighting, and I think that's a different John Wu. But again, if anybody has any questions about particular translations, I'm happy to entertain them at the end or whatever. because I think there are some ones that are absolutely criminally reprehensible. So, any other serious questions before we keep going? Okay. So, I would like to start with the Dao De Jing, and I would like to start with Chapter 2. I don't want to start with Chapter 1. It's just too profound. There's just too many things to talk about, and we would just spend the whole time doing that. So there's a couple of things I want to emphasize. First of all, let me be clear that my theory about the origin of the text is obviously different than the legendary account. My sense is that because part of the issue is whether there's a single or multiple authors of the text, whether there is a Laozi, which again is a euphemism, it's a title, the old master or the old mature child or whatever it is, or the old masters, because again there's no plurals or singulars in Chinese. So at this point, without going into a ton of detail, my best guess about the origin of the text is that somebody at some point, like Ben Franklin producing the Poor Richard's Almanac, somebody collected a variety of sayings from a variety of sources, from a variety of countries and cultures in a variety of languages, and rendered them into contemporary colloquial language, and then published them as a book of poems. And so that's what I think the Dao De Jing originally was, that somebody produced a series of extremely short aphorisms, and that's why I think the text was originally way shorter than it is now. And I will be able to defend that claim more thoroughly, I think, when we talk about Chapter 7, and I want to make sure we get to that, so I'll be able to make that argument more clearly. But in each chapter, I think, and this is part of my ongoing work on the text, I do think we can identify a or maybe several central short poems that the rest of the chapter seems to be commentary on. Again, this is the work that I'm doing now, so it's not like this you're going to read about this. This is pretty, and other people I think are coming around and working on this too. So, but it is kind of cutting edge. But I do think in this case the central poem in Chapter 2 is that first 4 lines, that under heaven all know the beautiful is beautiful, thus ugliness is already present, all know what is good as good, and thus bad is already present. Now there are, basically the Chinese is again exquisite, and is such a succinct series of passages that it really does stand alone. And again, once we get to the word therefore, it does seem, and again, this will be so much clearer in another chapter, in Chapter 7, but it does seem at this point, therefore, somebody's explaining this aphorism to us. Somebody's going to draw some moral or normative principle, and that normative principle is always expressed in the chapter as, therefore, the sage does this. 是以圣人, therefore the sage says this or does this or operates this way or whatever. Oh, and I did want to emphasize again that the handout, there is a handout for this text, and the passages that I'm working with are on the handout, and that the link to the handout is in the description of the video. So if you go down below a little bit, you should be able to pull that up. Okay. Anyway, so that first 4 lines, I think, is the central poem, and the rest of it kind of elaborates on that. And other translations of that first 4 lines seem to emphasize, go in a slightly different direction. That it's, though when people recognize the beautiful as beautiful, that is ugly. That it's ugly to recognize the beautiful as beautiful. And as the next line would say, it's not good to recognize the good as good. Okay? Now the problem I have with that, and it may seem obvious, I don't know, it seems obvious to me, is that if you're judging people for saying what's beautiful and what's not, well, that seems to be the same kind of judgment that you're judging. So it makes more sense to me, and I think it's consistent with the way the rest of the text tends to read, to see this as that basically the polarity, not necessarily opposition or not even relativity, but polarity of all dualities. And I think that's what we see here is in this chapter, once we have those first, within the first four lines about under heaven all knows the beautiful is beautiful, thus ugliness is already present. To specify the beautiful is already to compare it to something which we are then, whether we're being explicit about it or not, identifying as the not beautiful. And same thing with the good and the not good. To specify something as good is to distinguish it from other things which are obviously not that. So the two arise simultaneously. And the first chapter, even though we're not saying it, you can go back and look, the first chapter also says that all dualities arise simultaneously, and then we have different names, but the two names are two sides of the same coin. And you can't have heads without tails. So I do think that's what we're saying here too, because then it goes on to describe 6 more types of mutuality, slightly differently phrased, but necessarily mutual. So for instance, presence and absence engender each other. Difficult and easy complement each other. And of course these are translations, but even in the Chinese there's a different Chinese word for each of these types of mutualities. The term mutual here is the word xiang, which shows up in each of these things. This xiang this xiang this. In other words, this is xiang something, mutually does this to this. So mutually engenders or mutually constructs, and so on and so forth. And so again, to me this chapter is about the non-dichotomous nature of all these polarities, is that they both arise simultaneously. They're poles on a spectrum. They're not two entirely different types of things, and they produce each other. And this is really important for later on when we talk about the metaphysics of this, because it does say here very explicitly, presence and absence engender each other. Now the word presence here is the word yo, which is, again, like often translated in the ontological reading as being or existence, but really means possession or to have or something like that. So yo on the one hand is often translated as being, as opposed to wu, nothing or absence or none or without, on the other hand, which is often translated then as non-being. And so it does seem to, sometimes you'll see this translated as being and non-being create each other. Now, of course, and I'll emphasize this later, that non-being and being also, we don't have to read it that way, but even presence and absence can be understood in the same way. So we do have a question here, yeah, which is there a line drawn above? Let's see, Justin, is the author assuming that the beautiful in this passage is self-evident? Or would that change depending on the context? Yes, it could definitely change depending on the context. And in fact, the Zhuangzi makes that so beautifully clear. Not that we want to read the Laozi through the Zhuangzi, but I do think Zhuangzi was aware of Laozi. But he says, what's beautiful to a monkey is not what's beautiful to a person, and what's beautiful to one type of person might not be beautiful to another type of person. So I definitely think there's room for differing definitions of beauty. But no matter how we define beauty, to define beauty is to isolate it or distinguish it from whatever is not beautiful. And so again, I think that there's plenty of room to change that on the context. It's only based on what we're comparing it to. And then there's another question about, is there a line drawn between those specific mutualities? No, or at least not an absolute line. We can draw that line wherever we want for our convenience sake. We can say that up to a point we're willing to call it this, and beyond that point we're willing to call it something else. But I think that's the most we can do, because again, the problem here is that you're talking about applying words to things, and that's what sometimes is called a Socrates problem. But if we say up to a certain point it's this, how do you exactly draw the line where beyond that point it's not this? So I do think that's why I'm describing it as a polarity rather than a dichotomy. And of course, once we apply the language to it, then it becomes this or that. And that's the problem, I think, with language. And as we'll talk about when we get to the Zhuangzi, I think that's going to be really clear. Anyway. So, any other questions? So anyway, a couple of other just important really things I think about this particular chapter is it is also the first time in this text the phrase wu wei shows up. The term wu wei, or non-doing, or doing without, wei wu wei, doing without doing, and it's the first time in the text that that passage shows up. Because what it says here is that therefore the sages, again, that's the language I said always indicates the introduction of that normative principle. Therefore the sages, and again, I've translated it in the plural, even though most translations translate it in the singular. Therefore the sages abide in the business of non-confrontation, in the doing of, and that's how I'm translating wei wu wei, as non-confrontation. And I don't think that's a controversial translation. I think a lot of translations will see it as non-confrontation, non-interference, and so on and so forth. Even for some reason, even the non-process readings tend to read it that way. So again, this is the first time that phrase is introduced. The sages operate according to wu wei, and they and everything, and they don't have to say anything, and everything just happens without having to be told what to do. And that's wei wu wei, is that basically you basically lift a finger and everything kind of falls into place. We're going to see that consistently, that kind of unobtrusive efficiency of knowing exactly just the smallest touch that makes everything happen. And I think we'll see again that in some other chapters. And then finally, I think it's also significant that the last couple of lines also talk about then that the sages create without claiming, act without getting hung up, and it's basically again about not getting stuck, I think, on the, at least in the terms that we've been reading it here, not getting stuck on the categories that we're applying. And I think this is relevant to, I think what the way Justin put it is that you know, at one time we might want to make that distinction one way, and at another time we might want to make that distinction another way. And we don't want to be hung up on only making that distinction, I think, in one way. And I see that Brian is there weighing in on the sage abides, and I do want to point out that it is Brian's birthday today, so happy birthday to Brian. Anyway, I'm not going to say that, I don't, all of a sudden I'm going to get a wave of people saying it's my birthday too. Anyway, but shout out. So anyway, that's chapter 2, and again, if you can make notes of other questions on that, and if we have time, we can come back to it. But I would like to press on to chapter 3. I do think that one of the things I think that chapter 3 illustrates so clearly is the idea that, again, if we're talking about a process reading of trying to flow through time or flow through the world with as little interference or obstruction as possible, then obviously the bad guy here, the thing we're trying to avoid the most is friction, resistance, interference, conflict, and that's what this chapter is about, is that where does that conflict come from? Well, not honoring the eminent. We don't give out prizes for things, then people aren't going to compete with each other. If we don't place a high value on things that are difficult to obtain, then nobody's going to be tempted to steal them. So it does seem, and not displaying what's desirable leads people's minds to be unperturbed. And I think the attitude here is, again, it's a critique in some sense of consumerism. The idea that we get obsessed with the things that we own, and we identify with the things that we own instead of other types of qualities. But one of the things I really find fascinating about this chapter 3 is this is a perfect example of the polysemy I was talking about. The fact that the text can be read in at least 2 completely different ways. So, for instance, the 5th line, emptying, As again, we have this moral here, the normative principle. Subsequently, the sages manage by, again, that's our normative principle here. This seems to be a commentary, although this might also be another poem that also gets lapped onto this, or maybe the rest of it is commentary on this poem. Hard to tell. But the poem is emptying the mind, substantializing the belly, softening the will, and strengthening the bones. Now, in other translations, this comes out sounding extremely Machiavellian, if that makes any sense to anybody. That is to say, a very common translation of this chapter is something along the lines of, empty their minds. It's like the advice to somebody who wants to control people. Empty their minds, fill their bellies with food. And those words are added. If you see that in any translation, that is not what the text says. It doesn't say fill their bellies with food. And again, I'm going to read it in an entirely different way. But empty their heads and fill their bellies. And that seems to be like the Roman principle of, like, bread and circuses. Just keep them entertained and fed, and they won't ask serious questions. They won't challenge anything. Weaken their will. Often, again, if you look at the most translations, it says empty the mind, fill the belly with food, weaken their will or ambition, and strengthen their bones. Now, my reading is that sounds like, again, hopefully a benevolent despot, but it does sound like if you want to control people, keep them well-fed and ignorant. Keep them now, and there are many traditions that do accept, I think, the principle that ignorance is bliss. Certainly the Hebrew text seems to suggest that. The only time we were in bliss was before we acquired moral knowledge in any sense of the word. So it does seem, though, that that this could be read in this kind of Machiavellian way. But on the other hand, it can also be seen as a reference to Qigong, Chinese, what was sometimes called Chinese yoga or Chinese meditation. And this is also the case in Taiji boxing, which is a form of Qigong, a martial application of Qigong. So in the Qigong reading of this chapter, meditation version of this line, emptying the mind is the first stage in this type of meditation, and the Chinese character for emptying the mind is shu, which means to open up, to make vacuous. Open up the mind. And again, that's very interesting, because I think that some of you are familiar with maybe Indian models of meditation, where the goal of meditation is ekachitta, to shrink the field of attention to a single point, to concentrate the field of attention on a single point. The Chinese model is just the opposite, to expand the field of attention to include everything. And again, maybe those two things aren't that different, but the metaphors are certainly different. Certainly the imagery is different. But maybe if you really got to that point, it would end up getting to the same point. But the idea is shoo the mind, open the mind up, make it vast, substantialize the belly. In Qigong, basically the idea is to breathe in such a way that the qi accumulates in what's called the dantian, the belly, the field of elixir. That's what dantian means, because this is where qi tends to collect. And so, for instance, if you've seen, one of the things that may have confused some people is statues of the Buddha with a big fat belly, when he's supposed to basically have almost died of starvation, and basically ate one meal a day, and you wonder, where does that fat Buddha come from? And the fact is, that's an East Asian type of imagery, because in East Asian traditions, the qi, the prana, collects in the belly, and that swollen belly is literally a sign of literally being pregnant with spiritual energy. And some of the models, actually, there's an energy fetus that forms there and expands to fill the whole body, and that's when people become immortals. And then they can shed their physical bodies like snake skins, and then they're like Flying Tiger, Hidden Dragon, whatever those movies were, where the guys are flying through the clouds and changing their shape and all kinds of stuff like that. So empty the mind and render the belly substantial, but it doesn't say with food. And my argument is, not with food, with qi. It swells with qi. And that's why in China, in East Asian, I think generally iconography, the swollen belly is usually a sign of adeptness. And I have seen what I think of as, like Qigong masters who basically have little pot bellies, and it could just be the gentlemen of a certain age, but I don't think it's simply the fact that they've had one or two many Budweisers or anything like that, or Qingdaos, I guess. Anyway, so empty the mind, fill the belly with qi, soften the will. Again, the term that's often translated as weakness, I don't get it, is this term for pliancy, softness, which in this text is clearly a strength. It's not a weakness. And so, again, rendering the will pliant means that now we're flexible, we're not stubborn, we're not dogmatic, we're adaptable, and strengthening the bones. Finally, in Qigong, the idea is ultimately, and this is, by the way, one of the reasons why Qigong is recommended for older people, is because the qi is ultimately supposed to congeal in the bones, and the bones are supposed to become hard as steel, hard as iron bars. And that's why, again, because older people are prone to osteoporosis, it's extremely, I think, documented that this type of exercise, and yoga too, stress, as my yoga teacher Michael Fay tells me, again, any stress-bearing postures are going to increase bone density, but the idea is that helps build bone density. And so, and strengthens the bones. And so the image of the Taiji master, for instance, is somebody who on the outside is so soft and gentle and like cotton, and if you strike them, it'll be like hitting an iron bar. They're so soft and gentle. And I did have for a while trained with a Taiji master who basically looked like my grandmother, a little kindly little old man. And the first time we played, he said, "Okay, just push on me." And I pushed on his chest, and I didn't think he did anything at all, and I literally fell back like 20 feet. And it's just so subtle and profound. And again, who knows how to explain that? There's so many different ways to explain that. Anyway, but that's the whole image here, is that on the one hand, this could be read in this Machiavellian way of keep them ignorant and well fed, and they're going to be easily managed. And on the other hand, it could be a reference to a completely different whole concept entirely, this strategy of Chinese meditation, of Qigong. And I just think that's fascinating. And I am absolutely sure there are many other ways to read it too. But this is one of the things I mean by the polysemy of the text, the fact that it's so flexible. And arguably flexible. In other words, I could really make the argument that this is a way to read the text, because other times the text also talks about other types of Qigong breathing, like bellows breathing, where you bring the air from outside and air inside in and mix it, bring prenatal qi up and postnatal qi down, mix it and send it back. That's the bellows breathing. That gets mentioned here. Silk cocoon exercises, also another exercise in Qigong. That kind of thing is mentioned here as well. So clearly this book can be read as a book on politics, because it does say often enough, therefore the sage governs by, but it can clearly also be read as a book on meditation. Anyway, how are we doing? So far, so good? Okay. So at that point, then, I'm going to press on. I want to talk about chapter 4. Because, again, I think this chapter also, I think, just illustrates something about, well, one thing I think is really important about this chapter. This is a chapter that's often used to support the ontological reading, because it seems to suggest that there's some eternal entity that existed before time and that precedes everything and that eventually wears everything down, out of which everything emerges, and so on. But it's really important to pay attention to the rhetoric, even in Chinese, of this text. It starts off by saying, Taoing is like a well so deep that its operation seems inexhaustible. Now, right away, even in that first line, there are two words there that indicate that this is purely metaphorical. It's like a well so deep that it seems inexhaustible. And look at every line here. It seems to be the predecessor of the 10,000 things. Go down further. It is almost as if it goes on forever. It is as though it preceded. And so again, it seems to me this is definitely not a claim that something existed before the dawn of time, that something static and eternal is out of which the world emerged, and that's what Tao refers to. I think it says it seems like that, but it's really stopping short of claiming that it is like that. And again, it's just emphasizing again the unfathomableness of reality. And I don't want to get, my head's going to get blown in a moment, and when I start thinking about how amazing it is that anything exists at all. But anyway, I think that's really significant. And also, one other thing I want to emphasize about this particular chapter is the poem in the middle, which I think is Dowing blunts all edges, loosens all knots, softens all glare, and reduces everything to dust. And I do think this is about the fact that because there are so many Daos, and we talked about this last time, that the universe is made up of an infinity cube number of Dowings interfering with each other to some more or less extent all the time, and that so inevitably everything will be worn down. And I think that's kind of what this is saying, is that if there's a sharp edge, Dowing will eventually blunt that sharp edge. If there's a knot, it will eventually be untied. And glare being softened, this is my translation. This is not everybody agrees on that line. That's an obscure phrase, and I think that it makes more sense to see it almost like in terms of polarization. People see it as reconciling or harmonizing with the light, and I don't know what that means, but it seems to me that it's more like harmonizing the rays of light, the way glare is prevented by only allowing light waves of a certain orientation through, because glare is produced by light waves coming in at all angles. When we polarize the lens, it only comes in at certain angles, so it cuts down the glare. That once things kind of settle down, the glare gets reduced. This is one of those places where you're going to find everybody disagrees on the translation. Everybody disagrees, so it's probably pretty obscure.
Do you have another question about the translation from Eric?
Okay, so translation. Lege's translation of the first line of chapter 4 is that of an empty vessel instead of a well. Well, the only problem I have with an empty vessel is that it's described as being unfathomable, like it's so deep, and the vessel could definitely be a person, and I think that's one way of describing the sage, as somebody who's so infinitely deep that you can never completely exhaust their personality in some sense or another. That's why another place in the text it says that the wise people of ancient times were so subtle and obscure that you never knew what they were thinking. And I think that could also be the case here too. But I also think that so I prefer well just because of the fathomlessness of it, and the idea that no matter how many times you draw from that well, you won't exhaust it. And I do think, as Justin's pointing out, translating it as a well also implies some type of generative quality. Again, that we're producing, because the well constantly is refilling itself it's replenishing. And again, that's something about, again, the unfathomable nature of reality, is that somehow it just keeps happening. And, you can ask, like, where was it just before it started to happen? And of course, it's as though it were like this or that. So anyway, that's about what I'm going to do with that. Any thoughts or problems or questions? But otherwise, is there another one there? I think I got those two. Okay. All right, so I do want to make sure we get to chapter 7, because this is another example, I think, of how the text, I think, was originally produced. The first 4 characters are an exquisite little poem. Tian Chang Di Jiu. Heaven is long, earth endures, or something like that. And the question is, what the hell does that mean? What an obscure little poem that is. Well, don't worry, because the text goes on to say, the reason why heaven and earth can extend and endure is, and so clearly, this is a commentary on that poem. And this is the way Chinese commentary is always found, is that we find this phrase, this aphorism, or a line of a text, and then somebody says, to say that this is the case means, and then the commentary begins. And that is so clearly the case. So what seems to me is that over time, the commentaries, and so these poems have been distributed. What happens is, over time, somebody, various collections of these things may have been circulated. People write commentaries on these things that then get circulated. The commentaries get grafted onto the text, and all of this gets circulated. And then that gets recirculated, and people comment on that. And so basically, commentary gets grafted onto text and becomes part of the text. And so my argument then, again, consistently, if you look at each one of these chapters, I think it's possible to argue that at least one, and in some cases maybe more than one, for some of the longer chapters, line or two constitutes this central poem. And in this case, it's clearly the first, I think, couple of lines. Anyway, now as far as chapter 11 is concerned, again, I'm trying to skip through and just focus on certain issues here, because I do also want to have time to talk about the Zhuangzi, and I also want to have time to get the questions. But the most important thing about chapter 11, I think, is I would call this the Gestalt chapter. This is about the relationship between figure and ground, about negative and positive space, like those images where you have the two faces looking at each other in black, or it's a white vase in the middle. It depends on whether you're focusing on the negative or the positive space. It's like which one of those is present and which one of those is absent. And in some sense or another, to speak of what's present is always in some sense to distinguish what's present from its background. This is the Gestalt language. The figure is distinguished from the ground. And whatever is being the focus of cognition is the figure, and the figure always stands off against the ground. And so, in that sense, even though many times this is translated as being and non-being, and again, I'm going to gag on that ontological reading, but I think in this case it's so much clearly a case of presence and absence, because it talks about that there's 30 spokes around a wheel, but it's that empty space, it's the absence at the center of the wheel where the axle fits that constitutes the usefulness of the cart. Without that emptiness, without that absence, what's present would not be useful. And similarly, when you render clay into a vessel, and I'm hoping that my wife is listening at this point, it's the empty space in the bowl that makes the bowl useful. I mean, if you just had a big blob of clay, obviously it couldn't be used as a bowl. So it's what's absent that makes what's present useful. Similarly, again, if you had a house with no doors or windows, it would be useless. So it's where the openings are that makes it useful. So the conclusion seems to be that even though, and this is a line that is variably translated, and perhaps it's a matter of lost references, but the implication seems to be the same, is that what we normally focus on is what's of obvious benefit, which seems to be what's present. The positive space, what seems to be usually what's white in those diagrams, those Gestalt diagrams. But on the other hand, what turns out is that what really makes what's present useful is what's not present, is what's absent. And I think that's an important kind of implication. And again, rather than reading this metaphysically in terms of being and non-being, I'm suggesting we read this in terms of presence and absence, in terms of what's here, what's actually physically here, and what's actually physically not here, the empty spaces in those things that make them useful. La-di-da. Okay, well then I'm going to press on. I'm going to skip chapter 16. I do like chapter 17 because I think it emphasizes several things. First of all, it has a hierarchy of rulers here. And I think, I'm definitely rigorously avoiding getting political here, but I do think that we can definitely pay attention to the relevancy, the contemporary relevancy of these kinds of concerns. But it ranks different types of rulers. Basically, there are 4 different kinds of rulers. The best ruler is the one who's barely recognized, whose presence is barely known. The next one is the one who's loved and praised. The next one is the one who's feared, and the worst one is the one who is hated and laughed at. And then it comes to a conclusion. If one does not trust, one will not be trusted. And I do think that's the poem here, because then it says, these are invaluable words, and so on. But the last couple of lines is, when the ruler, coming back, the best one is the one that you hardly know is there. Everything gets done efficiently, quietly. The best rulers are the ones who don't need to get their picture taken getting medals or standing in front of, battleships or kissing babies or showing up at church. And they're the ones who quietly get the job done, and to the point where, and this is the last couple of lines of the chapter, it seems like it all happened all by itself. And everybody says, wow, look at that, look what we did. And we accomplished that, instead of needing to take credit for it. And I think this is why, it does seem at times as though, the best ruler is the one who is inconspicuous. And this is an example then I also wanted to point out of Wei Wu Wei. It's acting with minimal confrontation, minimal interference. If you're doing your job right, people shouldn't even notice that you're working. It shouldn't seem like you're working. Things just seem to happen all by themselves. Like Michael Jordan taking off from half court, putting the ball in the basket, having a cup of tea on the way, and ending up at the other end of the court while everybody is still staring. Anyway, sorry, now I'm fangirling again. So I do think that's significant. Again, this kind of idea of Wei Wu Wei as unobtrusiveness, as inconspicuousness, which is the result of this incredible subtlety, that you're doing it so subtly that people don't even know that you're doing it. And then chapter 20, let's press on and look at chapter 40. You can go back and look at these things later. If you have any questions on any of these things, you can always reach out to me. But I think chapter 40 is important, again, to tie into what we said before, because it's a very short chapter, and it starts off by emphasizing that reversal, fan, going back upon itself, is the way Daos move. And so, first of all, this seems to be an illustration of the principle of Taiji, the idea that things, all processes go from yin to yang. All processes oscillate. Everything, every process in the universe oscillates according to this principle between yin and yang, like a pendulum, like alternating current, like tides, like seasons. Everything oscillates. Everything goes out and comes back in, goes out and comes back in. And so what's really important is that it says everything under heaven is born from presence, and presence is born from absence. But then that also implies then, if we take the first line of the text seriously, that absence is also then born from presence. And so those who want to argue that Tao represents this primordial non-being, that the universe starts from non-being and proceeds to being, I think are overlooking this type of reflectivity. Because what happens is, if being emerges from non-being, well then, if you look at it the other way, when it returns, then non-being emerges from being. And to prefer one direction of that oscillation, I think, is just to arbitrarily say it starts here. Why couldn't it have started at something and gone back to nothing? It implies that there is this original point of nothing that began this oscillation. And I think there's no reason to assume that, especially when It specifically says that all Tao's reverse in this way. And going back to chapter 2, it says that Yo and Wu create each other, that presence and absence create each other. And so, again, it doesn't seem like it begins in one direction as opposed to the other. And I think that's really important. I'd like chapter 48 just to point out, the chapter here seems to be about different types of learning. Because again, I'm a scholar and I do like to accumulate things, and that's definitely what it's criticizing here, is that kind of learning is about accumulating more knowledge and understanding and so on and so forth. But when it comes to Taoing most efficiently, the idea is to divest. The idea is to minimize, to eliminate, to simplify, and get rid of everything that's not essential. Which reminds me of the anecdote that Irving Stone recounts about Michelangelo in The Agony and the Ecstasy, where somebody asked him, how do you produce these incredible sculptures? Michelangelo was playing with the guy, and he said, well, actually, the hard part is I find the block of marble that already has the statue in it. And then all I do is chip away everything that doesn't look like what the statue. I just chip away everything that's not the statue, which of course sounds so ridiculous. And the guy says, okay, well then I'll go send out my servants to find statues in marble. So, of course, that's not totally untrue. I do think that part of Michelangelo's genius was finding the marble that had the David in it, and finding the David in the marble. He liberated the David from the marble, and in that sense made it what it was always meant to be, allowed it to become what it was always meant to be, by eliminating everything that it's not. And again, I think the implication in this chapter is that as we grow, as we develop, we become weighed down, we become held back, we become inhibited by all these social factors, peer pressure, parental pressure, advertising telling us what real beauty is and what real success is and things like that. And we shut down our own creativity and our own confidence in our own insight. And the idea is to chip away everything that everybody has told us we should be in order to, in some sense or another, find the person we were always meant to be. And I think that's a beautiful metaphor. With regard to scholarship, one accumulates every day, but with regard to Taoing, one divests every day. Diminish some more until one arrives at Wu Wei, really efficient behavior and activity. And I think that's probably... Oh, and one other thing, if you read translations here, until one arrives at Wu Wei, it seems to mean non-doing, but we know what that really means. But then the next line is Wu Wei, or Wu Bu Wei. Nothing is done, and yet nothing is not done. And many translators lose that beautiful double negative, which I think is so characteristic of the poetry in this text that it seems to me kind of a travesty to eliminate. And so instead of saying nothing is done and everything is done, instead of saying nothing is done and yet nothing is undone, they say nothing is done and yet everything is done. And I think that's just, man, that's not what Lao Tzu said. That's what you're saying. Anyway. And then chapter 76, I'll just point out again, is about this kind of tolerance or flexibility. And if you look, that enables us to persist despite the resistance, the interference of other Taos. And the more tolerance we have, the more ability we have to avoid interference with other Taos. The more other Taos will not interfere with us. And again, I think that's really clearly illustrated here. And ironically, again, many people translate that notion of pliancy and flexibility as weakness, which I think completely defeats the point. One last thing to emphasize about the last chapter, chapter 81, is this critique of language. Again, it does seem like Lao Tzu. Again, one other thing that the story of Lao Tzu, that legendary account, seems to try to explain is Lao Tzu's criticisms of language. Again, that one thing that story explained is the terseness and polysemia of the text. But it also explains, at least this is one of the things I think the story was trying to explain, is the idea that the text is so critical of language, and yet he wrote a book. So the text seems to explain that he didn't want to write a book, but he was forced to. And so even though he's writing the book, he's warning us not to take the language too seriously, not to get too hung up on the words. And there's a chapter in the Zhuangzi that will also make a very similar point. So I want to make sure we have time to get onto that. Now I'm going to press on and just say a few words about the Zhuangzi. And in the meantime, if there are other questions that pop up about the Laozi, we can come back to that at the end. But I did want to say just a few general words about the Zhuangzi. Again, a little bit about my history with it. I first read it carelessly in grad school. I just read it, briefly. I read the basic writings version, and for some reason it just seemed to go right over my head. I don't know what was going on at the time. But then when I prepared for my oral exams, after we wrote we had to write a preliminary exam, written exams, and then had to defend our written exams in order to go on to the dissertation phase. In preparing for my written exams, I just read the Zhuangzi again, and then stopped everything, read the whole thing, went back to other translations. So it was just this blowing my mind epiphany where I couldn't believe that I didn't get this out of the text the first time. And so went back to the Chinese and so on. And at this point, clearly, the Zhuangzi is clearly one of my desert island books. It seems to have been produced somewhere between 250 and maybe 300 or 350 or so BCE, end of the Warring States period, and edited significantly later by a guy named Guoxiang, probably during the Neo-Confucian period, somewhere around 300 or so CE. So again, the text as we have it now is very corrupt. There seems to be a lot of other stuff in there other than the works of Zhuangzi. But the first 7 chapters known as the inner chapters, seem to be of this consistent literary genius that it's unmistakably written by the same guy. So that's the stuff I usually refer to when I think of the Zhuangzi. There are other pieces of it that are scattered through the other parts of the text, and I think that, so there are other places where you also see that kind of brilliance, but a lot of it also seems to be by people who are kind of trying to write in the style of Zhuangzi, and you can definitely see the difference. Yeah.
We do have a few questions coming in, some from still the Dao De Jing.
Yeah. I'm looking at the questions on the Daodejing. I'll come back to Justin's question later. The Bhagavad Gita being forced or lectured to put into words. The question is, didn't this concept also about language also come up in the Bhagavad Gita? I think not so much in the Bhagavad Gita. I think more so in, for instance, Advaita Vedanta, other forms of Indian thought, more so than the Gita, because the Gita is clearly a work of literature and was written as a celebration of language, not as a critique of language. At least maybe that's just too brief of an answer. Justin Jones is pointing out a thing about timing, deal with it before it happens, set things in order before there is confusion. Again, this is one of the aspects of effective action, is that you can deal with things at the right time. You can avoid maximum interference. And I do think, as Nate is asking, that the idea of not interfering, it in some sense it is a paradox, but only if you take it literally. The question is not interfering a paradox the same way the Buddhist desire to end all desire is a paradox? And I only think Wei Wu Wei is a paradox if you think of it in absolute terms. So the goal is to not interfere as much as we normally do. We try to minimally interfere. We're not trying to eliminate all interference. That just is impossible. So anyway, and yes, the goal is to eventually not even interfere with yourself by not trying to stop yourself from interfering. So boy, isn't that subtle? That is subtle and subtle and subtle. And that is, again, the part about mistrust in language. Can be read as proof that he was forced to read the Dao De Jing, but
Right.
that to write that he was forced to write the Dao De Jing, but I think that I think it's more likely that it's proof that the book was written to explain why he wrote the text, even though he mistrusted language. So anyway, at least I'm a skeptic that way. So I don't see any other questions right now, so I'm going to press on. And I am not going to work on the first one here, the use of the useless. You can read that on your own, but it's about flexibility and finding new ways of seeing things, a little bit like the Taoist idea of wonder and seeing infinite possibilities in things. I did want to focus on the story of Butcher Ding. I do think that's a critically important story, and many of you have heard me tell you this before. But this is, to me, maybe one of the great stories of all time, and I could just read this a million times. But the story is Butcher Ding carving up an ox, and if anybody's ever seen Edward Scissorhands, that's what you want to picture here. Edward Scissorhands had, ironically enough, scissors for hands, and was this incredible arborist and barber, but could look at a hedge, then attack it, and he'd be like a blur of activity. Leaves would go flying, and then he'd jump back, and you'd see this intricately carved statue of several monkeys on a limb tossing coconuts at each other or something. And so it's just, and then he'd hit a tough spot, and he'd slow down, and he'd go at it again. And that's exactly what's being described here. And the translation is beautiful, but the text is magnificent in Chinese, even down to the onomatopoeia when he talks about every thrust of his knees, zip, zoop, that shows up in Chinese. He slithered the knife along with a zing, and all was in perfect rhythm. And the fact is, his explanation of how he goes at this is that he just has this intuition, this daemon, this spirit, this autopilot that seems to go into effect, where he's not seeing individual things anymore. He's just finding the spaces between things. He's not cutting things. He's finding where the spaces already are, and that's why his blade lasts forever without ever having to be sharpened, even though normally most blades have to be sharpened frequently because most cooks hack. So the implication here is that if we live properly, and again, not interfere, that we can learn how to live most efficiently and most effectively. And Lord Wenhui's final words after seeing all of this is, excellent, I have heard the words of Cook Ding, and I've learned how to care for life. Again, the butcher is the perfect example of Wei Wu Wei. He just allows himself to be in this intimate relationship with the object to the point where everything is perfectly evident. You're not cutting anything. You're finding the places where the knife needs to be. And this kind of freedom that we find in the Zhuangzi is not so much freedom to do whatever you want. He can't hack anywhere he wants. It's freedom from the psychological, maybe, problems that cause us that make us unable to find where that opening is, that we try to force the opening rather than allowing the opening to make itself evident to us. And it is about finding the path of least resistance, as Justin points out. But again, it's about finding the path of least resistance, which took an awful lot of work. It's not laziness, because it took a lot of work and training to get to that point. And as you read the story, he explains the training process. It took him a long time to get to the point where he can do this without even having to think about it. It's just pure intuition at that point, like Fred Astaire dancing, like Jimi Hendrix playing the guitar. It takes tons of work to get to that point, but once you get to that point, you can just let it happen. You can let it flow through you. I think about Hendrix playing, and I imagine he's not thinking, well, I'm going to try to do this, and I'm going to try to do that. It's like afterwards, it goes, whoa, what did I just do? And that's how Cook Ding steps away and goes, wow, whew, that was incredible. And even he doesn't know how he did it. And I think that's because he gets lost, he gets caught up in it, And I think it's just such a magnificent story. I suggest you read it and read it again because I find it so beautiful. And the last chapter I want to read, because I also want to leave time for more general questions, is the story of the fish trap. And this, to me, one reason I want to read it is because this illustrates to me how magnificent a translator, and this, yes, as Eric asks right there, I'm seeing is the flow states, or as Justin says, in the zone. The flow states, which is what Csikszentmihalyi talks about, this notion of flow. And the name Csikszentmihalyi is spelled with way too many vowels, C's and Z's. And but I did actually learn how to pronounce it. And Csikszentmihalyi is a name that if you're going to learn how to pronounce, you're going to try to work into a conversation at least 2 or 3 times a day. So Csikszentmihalyi's idea of flow states is absolutely equivalent to this notion of wei wu wei, in the zone. That's exactly what we're talking about if you want to look that up later too. But to me, this story of the fish trap is illustrative of Burton Watson's absolute mastery of translation. And anybody who has ever tried translation knows that, generally speaking, it's easy to find primary translations, words that share the primary meaning of a word. The problem is that the more literary the work is, the harder it is to be able to translate the secondary and tertiary meanings of the words. Is that, and that's what literature is. When you read the great writers, to me, it's that they're exploiting the secondary, tertiary, in some cases, quaternary meanings of the words. It resonates with meaning. And a clumsy translator will find the primary meaning and lose all the other meanings. A good translator will maybe come up with a second layer of significance. Very rarely are you going to find people who can get to the tertiary level and still salvage all that. But to me, this is unbelievably perfect. The story, it's about language, and later, if you want to, we can talk about Zhuangzi's theory of language, even though it's not his theory, it's mine. But he says the fish trap exists because of the fish. Once you've gotten the fish, you can forget the trap. The rabbit snare exists because of the rabbit. Once you've gotten the rabbit, you can forget the snare. Words exist because of meaning. Once you've gotten the meaning, you can forget the words. And this is the beautiful part. Sorry, I'm fangirling again. Where can I find a man who has forgotten words so that I can have a word with him? And I think that is just so magnificently beautiful. Because what does it mean to find a man who has forgotten words? It means someone who's not insisting. This is somebody who's willing to come to terms. That when they're having a conversation with you, they're going to allow you to use the words in your own way. They're going to allow their own meaning of the words to be emptied and allow you to use the words in your own way rather than misunderstanding you by placing words or meanings into your mouth. Is that, by insisting that you mean this when instead you mean that. And that's the problem here, is that the man who has forgotten words is the man who's capable of letting you use words in your way, say what you want to say, and be able to adapt to that, to be able to talk to you in your own language, rather than insisting that you have to mean. And that's the only way to have true understanding, is to be able to actually listen to what other people are saying, and then be able to, in some sense, say back to them, is this what you mean? And if they say no, well, then you still have to work on it. But clearly, the man who has forgotten words is the person who is flexible in their language use. And that's another example of wei wu wei, being able to be flexible and adaptive in our language use, instead of insisting that the words only mean what I mean. And later on in the Zhuangzi, it also talks about different types of language use. It talks about what are called goblet words. And goblet words seems to be an example of what we're talking about here. And goblet words is a tough translation. Nobody knows exactly what to make of it. But it does seem to be a reference to a certain type of measuring device that apothecarists used to use, where they would, basically, when you filled this vessel, after it got to a certain height, it would tip and spill itself out until it was just the right amount. So it'd be, if you overfilled it, it would balance itself out until it was the right dosage or amount. And so the idea is it's a self-emptying cup. And that's what we mean by these goblet words here. This is the way I'm understanding it anyway, is this way use of language. The person who has forgotten words, who's able to empty out and then fill up again with new meanings, and then empty out and fill up with new meanings. But somebody who's not stuck on only one sense of language. And I do think that this is similar, as Justin says, to what Lao Tzu means when he talks about the sage sometimes seeming confused and seeming to others as childlike, because they're not stuck. They have this sense of wonder. It could be this, it could be that. They're playful. And again, that is definitely childlike. I think the problem is it can also be misunderstood as childish or immature. And I don't think it has to be understood that way, especially when it comes to, when we tend to, I think, underestimate the intelligence or wisdom of children. I think, we tend to forget. We tend to forget what we knew as children. And in some sense, as we said, it's a matter of recovering that flexibility that we had when we were children. Anyway, so I think at that, I think I'm going to stop because I think there's at least a little bit of time left here if people have any more specific questions to ask. And I'm going to take a second while you give that some thought to refreshing my...
While we do you want to give an update on our donations?
Do you have a most current?
I do.
Okay, so we want to give you an update on the most current amount of money raised, and I want to say more about that when we're done too. But hold on, let me get the number here. What's our number now?
Our number now is
$2,716 raised for the Food Bank of Delaware. That is awesome. That's incredible, and I'm just really stunned by that, and I think that pays for an awful lot of food for an awful lot of people who need it. So while you're thinking of questions, I'm going to say a few thank yous. I want to thank everybody who watched and participated. Not surprisingly, as I look at the names on the chat there and so on, I can picture faces for almost all of your names, and I am truly grateful to each and every one of you just for being here, whether you were able to contribute or not. I want to thank Sarah and Spur Impact for helping us with the website. I want to thank Kaylee Whitman and Crystal White for the artwork and the marketing aspect of all of that, because I think that was really amazing stuff. I want to say a special thank you to my daughters. I did not realize what a bumbling oaf I have become in my dotage until I got involved with this. Particularly challenging for a lifelong self-described chalk and blackboard kind of guy, and absolutely could not have done this without both of them, without both of their help in front of and behind the scenes. They both put many hours in on this, and anyone who's gotten anything out of these talks pretty much owes it to them. That's what I think anyway. I am eternally grateful to them. They've been just incredible. So if you can, please contribute to the Food Bank of Delaware, or whenever you can, help out wherever you can. And let me be clear, and this is really important these days, is that those who can help, I hope you are willing to help, but those who need help, I hope you're willing to ask for help. I think it's really important, if we're a community here, that we do want to help each other out in whatever way we can. And there's always some kind of way of being helpful. Don't be afraid to ask for help. If other people asked you for help, you would say yes, and other people would be delighted to help you. So I don't want to dwell on that. So teasers for next time.
Justin Jones.
Justin Jones. Oh, diving into David Chai's Zhuangzi and the Becoming of Nothingness. David's a friend of mine, and we've worked together on several occasions, and he's got this ontological reading. I think I'm starting to wear him down. I don't know. He's deeply committed to it. I do think he's got a lot of insight on the Zhuangzi, but I do think he still gets stuck on this language of nothingness. I don't know what nothingness is. I don't know what non-being is, and it just confuses me. And when he, I think, ends up being straightforward about it, it turns out he's not really talking about non-being. And so, yeah, I mean, if I do think it's current work, it's cutting edge. I do think if you're going to read works on Zhuangzi, I really like the work of Brooks Zaporin. I think he's got real insight. He also has a commentary. He has a book on Guoxiang, the commentarist of commentarist. I don't know what the word is anyway. Commentarist of the text. And so, if you have a question about that, I can also give you a more extensive bibliography later. But these are deep dives. So commentariat, yeah, you think so? I'm not quite sure about that. But it is now, because I'm a doctor and I have a license to neologize. So it is now officially commentariat.
Reverend Doctor.
I'm a reverend doctor, I am, as some of you out there know. Commenty person, I like that one too. So anyway, with all that in mind, if there is continued interest, I would like to do this again. I'd like to take a week or two off, but then I would like to maybe do a 2 or 3 week series on the Dead Sea Scrolls. I find, to me, the Dead Sea Scrolls is one of the most unbelievably, incredibly interesting and fascinating, amazing scholarly stories of our time. And it touches on so many things that are so interesting. And it definitely blows my mind. So if that's something anybody would be interested in, let me know if that sounds appealing, and watch Facebook or YouTube for the details. You can follow me on the YouTube channel and on Facebook. And again, I'll be interested to know if people are interested in something like that. And if again, that would be for a different charity, but I'd still like to try to raise some money. We don't expect to raise this kind of amount of money in the future. I didn't expect to raise it this time. And we might, but let me be clear that the idea is I'm really glad to have people here, and the more we can raise for the more local charities, the more help we can give to people. It's really incredible. And so the question is not to come off sarcastic, but if the Dead Sea Scrolls falls under our time, what definition of our time are you using? Well, I'm mostly talking about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which took place in 1948. But you're right, the story goes back thousands of years. But the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think, is one of the most amazing scholarly stories of our time. And it touches on fascinating stuff that goes back thousands of years, back to the roots of Christianity and early temple, late temple, and early post-temple Judaism. So again, my only problem with talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that I tend to again go into fugue states because it's so amazing and blows my mind. Anyway, not to whet your appetite too dramatically. So, are there any other problems or questions that I can answer?
Would you like to comment on Lao Tzu anticipating returning shopping carts to the appropriate place?
What's the question here?
That's from Justin. He said you'd get back to it at the end.
I'm trying to find Justin's.
Who writes, the sage has no mind of his own. He is aware of the needs of the others.
Yeah. So Justin Jones' question, though, Justin is asking a question that reflects a recurring theme in Justin's questions. Do we think that Lao Tzu was anticipating returning shopping carts to the appropriate place? And he quotes Dao De Jing, the sage has no mind of his own. He is aware of the needs of others. And so the answer to your question, Justin, is Lao Tzu would return the shopping cart. The problem is Lao Tzu wouldn't go to Walmart. So I'm torn on this one. I think I think there's subtleties to your question that we need to reflect on more carefully. Let's see what else is up here that I may not have commented on. La di da. I think we're pretty good here. All right. Any other thoughts, problems, or questions? Okay. Well, everybody, thank you. Happy summer. And congratulations to UD graduates and all the graduates, everybody graduating from high school, college, kindergarten, preschool, and so on. Obviously, this is not what you had in mind, but we are all celebrating all of your successes, and so you'll have to be satisfied with that. Shout out to everybody. Okay, any other thoughts, problems, or questions other than that? I think I'm just going to go ahead and say namaste to you all, and best wishes, good luck, and hopefully I'll be back in a few weeks, and we will, as Justin says, we will get some ritual cleanliness on. Okay, we'll get that going. Okay, thank you, and good night.